Hello, and welcome to another podcast from Progressives for Immigration Reform. I am your host, Kevin Lynn, and I am joined today by Chris Farrell of Judicial Watch. And this is going to be a really exciting podcast for our viewers because Chris Farrell was down there on the ground in Guatemala following the Caravan, interviewing people in the not just at the Caravan, but also at the highest level of the governments of the countries that he was in. So it's going to be a really exciting podcast. I'm glad you're here to join us. For those who may not be familiar with Progressives for Immigration Reform, we were formed in 2007 with the express purpose of having a conversation with our progressive brothers and sisters about the unintended consequences of unbridled immigration. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to someone who's very knowledgeable on this topic that has been drawing so many headlines over the past couple of weeks. And so without any further ado, Chris Farrell, welcome to Progressives for Immigration Reform. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Kevin. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you here. As I just mentioned, you were on the ground there. But before we get into that, now, for those who may not be familiar with Judicial Watch, over the years, I've watched Judicial Watch. You seem to be this very nonpartisan organization because when there are Democrats in office, you're going after Democrats. When the Republicans in office, you seem to be going after Republicans. You seem to be a group that's really searching for the truth and looking for answers. And I thought when I heard about your expedition south, I thought why Judicial Watch and why not CNN and all the other major news agencies? I mean, isn't it their job to report the news?
Well, a couple of things, Kevin. First of all, thanks for having me on. Judicial Watch is a government watchdog group. I jokingly say that we're equal opportunity offenders. We've upset Republicans and Democrats alike. In all candor, we're philosophically conservative, but that doesn't hold us back. We've sued the Bush administration, we've sued Obama, we've sued the Trump administration. For us, it's about principles over politics. And so we do what we do, in an effort to get accountability and transparency in government. Syracuse University just came out with a study that showed that we are the country's leading FOIA or open records, federal open records filer, and the leading litigator. The next three organizations behind us don't total what we do in numbers. I'm very proud of it.
And Chris, you are the lead investigator for Judicial Watch. Is that correct?
Yeah. 20 years now, believe it or not. It's a long time.
Wow, it flies, doesn't it?
It does. So, unfortunately, as you made reference to, we went out and decided to commit an act of journalism.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Knocked me over with a feather.
So instead of sitting in a studio in New York or Washington and talking about the Caravan, we decided to go and let's see what's happening. And so myself and two colleagues, Sarah Carter and Irene Garcia, the three of us went down to Guatemala. We had good contacts in country, which really helped facilitate things.
Now, the Caravan did start in Honduras, correct?
Yeah, so the first couple of waves really came out of Honduras. There's been a subsequent wave out of El Salvador, but really the chief sort of avenue or route is coming out of Honduras up through Guatemala and then into Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so Irene and Sarah are both native language fluency Spanish speakers. I am not, so it was very helpful to have them along. And so they conducted interviews, we did video, we spent time with the Caravan, with these they really sort of came in waves of marchers heading north. Mm-hmm. We can talk about the details of that.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe start more generally. Sure. Chris, how would you characterize the Caravan?
Right. For the 4 days that I was there, I would say overwhelmingly, like 98th percentile and up, overwhelmingly young men 15 to 40. That's the bracket that I would. That's not perfect, but that's an approximation.
the mainstream media is talking about the women, the children, the families, and
Yeah.
you're saying that is a mischaracterization.
It is. There certainly are women and children. I want to be very clear, but they are in a super minority. And so
Wow.
you may see, video clips that kind of repeat of, a mom and a crying kid. And I mean, that's all true. I'm not discounting that. All I'm saying is that a lot of that coverage is not truly representative of the overwhelming number of people that are coming north. And those are young men, mid-teens to early 40s.
So these are able-bodied working men.
Absolutely, and they overwhelmingly expressed not an asylum claim,
Okay.
or not a legitimate asylum claim. They were straight up economic, work driven, work oriented. Hey, I've got a cousin in Texas, and he does roofing work, and he says he can get me a job. I mean, that's anecdotal and a snapshot, but it's representative of the vast majority of folks.
Interesting, because like you said, you'd been down there for 4 days, held
Right.
multiple conversations. Now, it's an interesting aspect of this because we hear about their need for this enormous need for asylum for these people because of what's going on in their country. Can you tell our viewers what differentiates an asylee from say, in this case, an economic migrant?
Right. Well, the asylum threshold specifies some sort of persecution, either politically or through some criminal act. It's either the state or the security services or police forces or political parties, really persecuting someone for political beliefs, religious beliefs, those sorts of things. And that's quite different than, hey, I just want a better job, and I know that America offers an opportunity for prosperity, and that's and that's really the threshold. That's the difference. One is being persecuted for religious, political, et cetera, those beliefs. The other is, I mean, it's smart because they do want a better life, and I don't begrudge anyone that. But there's a process, right? There's a law. There's a system for doing that, and that's really the offset or difference between the two.
As I had mentioned earlier, here at Progressives for Immigration Reform, back in 2007, what we found that this unbridled immigration, not just illegal immigration, but also immigration that was going on a much grander scale than, let's say, post 1965,
Right.
really endangering our most vulnerable workers here in the U.S. because
Look, all it does is drive wages down. I mean, this is economics 101. When you bring large numbers of either semi-skilled or unskilled laborers into a marketplace, there's all sorts of consequences. And one of the most basic ones is it drives wages down, and that affects the most vulnerable, the least skilled, the most at risk. And in the economic bubble, you can squeeze that balloon. There's economic pressures, but when you squeeze it on the personnel side, and you have a vast pool of semi-skilled and unskilled laborers, the only people that would support that would think that the poor are paid too much, that they should be poorer. I mean, that's all that does, really.
Absolutely. We recently did an incognito interview with a building inspector in Los Angeles. And the tales that he would tell were so grim because when he started in the construction trades in the 1980s, those were good upper middle class jobs.
Yep.
Today, working on some of the big projects in downtown Los Angeles, the average construction worker is probably making about $10 to $12 an hour. And that's not a livable wage in Los Angeles.
Certainly.
And he pointed out, 75% of those workers on these sites are illegal immigrants. So the wage threshold has just been ratcheted down to the point where you can't make a good living off of the construction trades anymore.
And the flip side of that, of course, is that from the employer's side, you put the businessman, many of which are small business owners, in an impossible position because he knows that if he pays an American a fair wage, he's going to be undercut by competitors who are also tax cheats.
Right.
Because they're not paying all the normal employment taxes. And so now you're putting the guy in a position of, well, does he have to break the law? Does he have to go outside the law to hire somebody who's unlawfully present?
He would definitely be at a competitive disadvantage if he didn't.
Correct. And so this is like a downward spiral. And, so you're putting businesses at risk. You're putting business owners who are trying to be ethical and do the right thing in an impossible position. You end up creating more tax cheats, which further erodes the base.
And frankly, that bar of honesty and integrity that
Right.
Any culture or civilization relies on to function smoothly. I can tell a story. I used to live in Los Angeles. I lived there for 20 years, and you can imagine being, for a period of time as I was on the executive board of the California Democratic Party and feeling the way I do about immigration. But I went down to eat once at one of my favorite restaurants, and while I was having my salad, one of the owners came up to me, and usually she'd ask, well, what are you reading, Kev? But today she said, well, can I sit down? I'm like, sure. And the first thing out of her mouth was, we can't do this without our illegals. And then she went on about how she can't get a native born to stand over that stove for 8 hours a day, and how they had a manager in there who took them to the labor board once. And when one of their illegals is sick, there's another one there in their stead the next day. And I'm taking all this in, and I go, well, should someone be over a stove 8 hours a day? Maybe 6 hours, or maybe we should have a wage system that speaks to, wow, they're jobs that are much more taxing physically. Maybe we should make some allowances there, maybe up the pay and lower the hours. And why did they take you to the labor board? And do you offer healthcare benefits and vacation and time off if you're sick? So these are all the things. And I don't think they want to be exploitative. But like you said, they're in a position where they would not be competitive if that weren't the case.
Yeah, it's a race to the bottom, which is very dangerous.
Absolutely. And which brings us back to the caravan. So again, all these workers coming up feeling that they have, and not so much them, I would imagine, but certainly there's some forces, some powers out there, some interests that want these men of working age in the United States. Did you before we get into, let's say, the interviews you had with people at the Caravan, do you have any thoughts on, or any evidence as to who is behind this?
Yeah, that is the burning question. There are organizations and names that are thrown around, and some of them are quite public, and there's been reporting on them. The Guatemalan government officials I spoke to were rather cautious, and they would say, well, there were leftist groups. And we'd say, well, which ones? And they would whisper, or they would imply, and they didn't want to be on the record about this, that there were groups that were in some way either dashed or dotted lines affiliates of Open Society Foundation organizations.
That's the George Soros organization.
Right. And so the president of Guatemala, we can get to this later, but just as a snapshot, the president of Guatemala is infuriated by this because he says, look,
don't they have almost a requirement to make sure that the needs, the health, welfare, and safety needs of these people are taken care of?
Because, look, you're putting people at risk. When you're taking these folks and you're pointing them in a direction, telling them go, and it's hundreds of miles, trekking on roads, it's a health and safety and welfare issue. And if you're a little more cynical about it, you're saying you're using these people as political props. You're not really concerned about whether they get a job with their cousin in Texas. This is a part of a larger movement question or issue of trying to create political pressure, sort of a political publicity stunt, or creating conditions that that pressure either the U.S. government, the Mexican government, etc. And unfortunately, it's these sort of everyday Hondurans that are being manipulated in a sense and put in danger or harm, because there's also criminal elements operating within the caravan.
Did you see criminal elements within the caravan?
I can tell you that I saw young men with Gothic script MS tattooed on their neck or collarbone.
And that would be the MS-13.
MS-13. I also had Guatemalan police officials tell me that they knew for a fact and had arrested and detained people who were acting as coyotes to move people, like guides, to help facilitate movement. And also, a Guatemalan official told me that they had been able to intercept or take custody of 7 young children who had been smuggled out of Honduras. And they were using the caravan itself as sort of the vehicle, not literally vehicle, but as the process to get these children north.
So it's a human trafficking operation going on.
Exactly. And so are there just regular guys in their 20s looking to make it to California or Texas or Arizona? Absolutely, there are. Are there bad guys that use that overall movement as a way to kind of burrow in and use the overall flow to kind of mask their movements? I have it from Guatemalan police, immigration, and security officials. Unequivocally, yes.
Did you speak to any of the Honduran officials or just Guatemalan officials?
No, I just was with the Guatemalan officials. I didn't speak with any Honduran officials.
And Guatemala is not a wealthy country. I would imagine something like this, causes a lot of consternation, knowing that they have to come up with the resources to support this. Did you notice that there were any of these, groups that, they whispered to you? Did you notice any support, either facilities?
Oh, yeah.
Or
in fact, the Minister of Defense, when we interviewed him, he was very explicit. He goes, "This is an elaborate, organized, planned out operation," and he said it was akin to a military operation.
Really?
The reason he said that is because, first of all, even the organization of sort of the waves or the groups that were coming through, there were designated rest points, water points, food points. There were clearly guys who were sort of like marshaling folks so that they kept people moving along. They knew when to break, how long. When we would show up and the cameras, our video cameras would come out, they would hush everyone and then point to designated people who had been identified to speak. And then when you turn the camera to them and said, "Hey, it seems like you're like in charge, you're like an organizer." "Oh, no, I'm just a volunteer. I just want to make sure everyone's safe." It's like, you're not in charge? No. You don't know, it was completely unbelievable because these people exercised authority over hundreds of people.
Because you saw them directing movement.
There was no question. And when they put their hands up and told everyone to hush, guess what they did?
They hushed.
They stood up and they sat down. So, it's very clear that this is
It was not Occupy Los Angeles. but Occupy LA, you would get so frustrating because, well, no one's in charge, so you couldn't get anything done. There was one speaker who he was there. He was a filmmaker and, pretty well-known filmmaker, but he had to walk off because he says, "You guys just don't seem to be able to get yourselves together for me to."
Yeah. Well, in this case, it was very elaborately laid out.
Wow, interesting. Now, my getting back to the forces once again that would put something like this on. What do you think? We see, there's that the statement "qui bono," who benefits from something like this. What is the benefit? Obviously there might be some very macro aims here. Are there any micro political aims that you can see at this point?
Part of it, again, one can look at it and say the departure of so many people out of Honduras is kind of double-edged sword. So at one point, it's like a pressure valve, right? It's a release of people who are underemployed or unemployed, frustrated, disaffected with the government, and the government itself is not necessarily thrilled with having that many people around who don't like them.
Okay.
Right, but that cuts the other way, because when people would say, well, I want asylum in the United States because well, I want a better job, but I don't like what's going on in my country. And then I would ask them, I'd say, well, are you married? Do you have kids? Do you have family back home? Or, oh yeah, I left my wife and kids there. So I said, well, wait a minute. If it's as bad as you're saying, why would you leave your wife and family there? Because they would arguably be the most vulnerable of the population. So you leave, but then in this very hostile, negative environment, you elect to leave family members behind. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's interesting you say that. And I'll be doing a podcast with a fellow who he grew up in Texas. His wife is El Salvadoran. And he came back from a long, extended visit with his church to El Salvador with an interesting take on things. When you look at the absence of the men, because the men have gone to North America to work, it has left a power vacuum at the village as well as the province level.
Right.
There was also, interestingly enough, a really amazing movie. I saw this at a film festival a few years ago, and the name of the movie was Los Angeles. And the director was Damian John Harper. And he graduated from Berkeley with a degree in ethnology, and he went down to a Zapotec village in Mexico, and he stayed there for 3 years. And when he did the movie, he actually went back to the village, and many of the people he knew were the actors and actresses in the movie.
Right.
And what you took away from this movie, what you couldn't help but see, was when the men go, that vacuum is created. Gangs held sway. The women would try to exert some control over things, but they couldn't. So you can kind of see where the social fabric just gets torn. And it really inspired me to kind of try to, work in my writings, talk about how the streets aren't necessarily paved in gold in America. Because when you look at Los Angeles, I moved from LA 2 years ago. And when I went back recently, Skid Row, I will tell you, is twice the size. And I used to live on Los Angeles and 6, right on Skid Row. It's twice the size of what it used to be. And there are homeless encampments under almost every underpass as you approach the downtown. So the streets aren't paved in gold there, and perhaps there's gold to be found in someone's village, whether it's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, Nicaragua. And that's kind of the tragedy of all this. It's almost like the opposite of a virtuous cycle. You have a cycle where things just get, it's catabolic, creates catabolic failure in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
So interesting. So you would, when you look at how you would characterize, so probably using the name Caravan is applying a bit of lipstick to a pig in this case, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, the pig gets angry at a certain point. Keep trying to put the lipstick on. Yeah, I mean, it's really a misnomer. I'm not sure who came up with that as sort of the official slogan or term. It's a very generous description of what's going on. This is really an intermittent river of humanity flowing north. And it sort of comes in waves or in groupings, but the notion that there's any sort of coherence to it is not accurate. The checkpointing, the water supplies, the marshaling of it is true, but there's no distinct, okay, this is Caravan 1, and it ends at this place with these people, and then, the second line of march starts here. It's organized, but it's not that organized. And so it's a pretty steady stream of folks with breaks and gaps. And I think Caravan is being very generous in its description.
Interesting. Were there any other insights you can share with us in the conversations you had with the members of the group?
Yeah, what's interesting is the number of folks who are sort of sprinkled in, who are not Honduran or El Salvadoran or Nicaraguan or Guatemalan. And
Hmm.
so,
where were they from then?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. So my two colleagues, their ethnicity, their heritage is Cuban. And so there's a particular rhythm, patois of Cuban Spanish that is different than other Spanish, or, whether it's Mexican, Guatemalan, etc. And so they were walking along, and the two ladies both kind of turned and looked at each other in surprise, and then snapped back over their shoulders because they heard Cuban Spanish.
Interesting.
And they yelled to these guys who were a few feet away, "Hey, are you guys Cubans?" And they took off running. We found out later that evening through a police contact that at the next checkpoint up the road, which is a place called Chiquimula, is the name of the town, in fact, 11 Cubans had been picked up because Guatemalan immigration officials were trying to screen and check people who were coming through to have some sense of order as to what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so they also told us that there were folks from, and this is quite a lineup, there was at least 6 other countries. There were folks from the Congo, Angola. I think the furthest afield was Bangladesh. And so there are other folks from other parts of the world who are, again, nestling into the flow. And I think that the total number of it, our Border Patrol or CIS would call it, special interest aliens, SIA, other than Mexicans, not the usual folks that you would expect regionally.
Gotcha.
So those, of course, came to the attention of not just the police forces, but also the Guatemalan security services, because they're wondering, hey, what's a guy from Bangladesh doing here? And how did he get here? And where's he going?
Right. Have you heard, what do you think the response of the U.S. government is going to be at this point? And it seems Mexico has been rather lenient in terms of allowing these folks just to stream up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the asylum rules generally, the international sort of covenants on asylum are that once you leave the country that's in danger, so let's say your homeland is the danger spot for you, the first country you get to that's peaceful or that's stable is where you're supposed to apply for asylum. So you don't
be Mexico in this place for many.
Right. So you don't kind of hop and skip to your favorite country. We saw this in Europe in 2015, where you would have folks transiting the Balkan countries and then go up into Central Europe and get to Hungary. And they say, oh, no, we want to go to Germany. And so they would choose their country of asylum, which is not, frankly, it's not normally the way that that's done, but that's what happened. And so now with Mexico, there's sort of a mixed message because AMLO is inbound as president in about a month or so. And he's essentially offered asylum, said, we'll find jobs, we'll give you housing. But at the same time, they're facilitating movement by the Mexican police and government, arranging buses. They stayed in the big national stadium in Mexico City. They set up a tent city for them. So there's this line between humanitarian, health, safety, food, water issue, and then facilitation, right? And that line may get blurry sometimes, but they are distinctly different. And I'm curious to see how much the Mexican government facilitates the movement north. That'll be the thing to watch.
Interesting. And I believe it's just probably a day or two away from large portions of the caravan reaching the border, correct?
Which is why I think President Trump today issued the order that he did with respect to, asylum seekers must present themselves at ports of entry and make a legitimate asylum claim under the rules that we discussed earlier. And it's, if you cross otherwise, forget about it. You'll be detained, but you'll also be returned.
Wow, interesting. That's a lot of returning to do.
Yeah,
It's,
well, what's interesting is the Guatemalan government. This is part of the interviews later on that we did. In the time that I was there, they had, I don't want to say intercepted because that sounds too aggressive, but they had identified, talked with, and then encouraged about 4,000 Hondurans to return to Honduras.
interesting.
So they had buses. So I mean, at some point they would come across Guatemalan immigration officials who would try to talk some sense to them and say, "You're going on a long, dangerous trip, and unless you realize what you're getting into, you're in great danger, physically, health-wise, you know."
Mhm.
Uh, and a large number of the Hondurans said, "You know what? You're right. This is not a smart move," and they opted to take a trip back via bus to Honduras.
Interesting. Wow. Well, Chris, we're coming up at the end of our 30 minutes together. Is there anything that I might have missed? Any insights you would like to share with our audience?
No, I think we've covered the bases. You know, there's the experience on the ground with the folks marching north, and there's these experience from various officials, whether they're police, security, defense, and then the President Morales himself. Um, they're not amused by this. The governmental officials, uh, they view this as sort of a territorial, not threat, but a challenge.
Okay.
The Minister of Defense was particularly keen on saying, look, our soldiers are not going to be put in the position of having to confront or engage with, either youth or women or children, because they're very concerned that the one finger, they're going to be called humanitarian
Right.
criminals or whatever.
Right.
They're highly aware of that, and they're trying to manage it as best they can.
One question is the Roman Catholic Church involved in any way in terms of helping to facilitate
Oh
this?
yeah, I mean the Catholic Legal Immigration Network (CLIN) is reported to be one of these groups that's involved. They've received tens of millions of dollars in U.S. government funding over the last 10 years or so, and so but they've got a role in this. They have a level of involvement, facilitating and coordinating. And that I think that's why there really does need to be a legitimate investigation as to
Absolutely. I mean,
who's
they're
behind this,
contingent
how much money.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're contingent beneficiaries to this.
yeah,
It just seems that the Catholic Church is all kind of grist for the mill when it comes down.
yeah.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for joining
Sure.
me today. I know my audience is really going to enjoy your comments, and to my audience, I'm going to post a link to Judicial Watch. Also, if there are any other links that you think might be helpful, I'll post them in the body of the YouTube comments, and encourage my audience to visit your website and see what they can do to support your good work.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye bye.